Thank you very much. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Mushiri, as you've heard. I am an optimist. I call myself, I describe myself as a garden variety optimist. I have great faith in the smartness of the policies that are developed on the continent of Africa. I have great confidence in the people who not only develop them, but attempt to implement them. But I think one of the things that I believe, and many of my colleagues at LDRI believe, is that the challenge is at the point where good policy needs to make the leap into good practice. So today, my comments will be oriented in this general direction. How do we access and use evidence, and different kinds of evidence, of course, the focus being here on data for decision making, especially in our efforts to end zero hunger, I mean, to make zero hunger a reality. So as you've heard, this is the Local Development Research Institute's basic orientation. We believe we could be really useful in supporting efforts of member states to deliver on ending hunger, poverty, and reducing inequality on the continent. We organize our work in generally 3 areas. We look at 3 areas within institutions, in government, and these are the 3 main ones: human capital, enabling environment, and strengthening financing. And here I'm talking about financing for decision support. So how is the government making investments to make sure that the data needed for decision making is available? But because I only have a few minutes, I will make judicious use of my time by focusing only on the conversation on enabling environment, which in itself has a number of things. You have issues around coordination that have to be addressed. You have issues around infrastructure. You have an enabling environment requires the right kind of policy and regulatory frameworks. And of course, you need knowledge management. You've all heard about the saying that government doesn't know what government knows. You know, sometimes it's because the left hand and the right hand, they don't even know they exist. So this is a very big part of it. But allow me to focus on just one of those, and that's the issue around coordination. If we believe that a developmental state is a critical success factor for achievement of Agenda 2030 and for Africa's Agenda 2063, and sectorally, or on an issue basis, the specific issues around ending hunger and extreme poverty, then we need to do something about the capacity of institutions, because there's an assumption here. And the assumption is that as long as the data is available, things will get done, or that the data being available is a sign that things are getting done. But despite my optimism, I don't believe this to be always the case. The ability of those who are implementing policies or even formulating policies to access, use, and share the evidence that underlies their work, it requires the right capacities in place, and there's an assumption about that being present. And that's why I will probably focus here a whole lot more and kind of belabor that particular point. So capable institutions require an enabling environment, and part of that enabling environment is making sure that the right coordination exists. So just to give you an example of what that could look like, within the SDGs, we have, of course, Goal 2, and associated goals, targets that are related to food and nutrition security, as you've heard. And Dr. Ailu mentioned the Malabo Declaration. Those 7 commitments have 43 indicators behind them. Those 43 indicators, if we narrow it down to 37, if we take out the indicators that have to do with mutual accountability and commitment to the CARE principles, probably looking at about 37. Those 37 are 152 data points. Many of those data points are also needed for measuring progress on the SDGs. For instance, you had about the commitment on investment in agriculture, which you will find as part of the means of implementation in SDG 2. But when it comes to where that data comes from, you're looking at more than 24 ministries, departments, and agencies in just about any of the governments that you pick across Africa. So how do we know that we are speaking the same language? How do we know that when we're looking for data on stunting in children under 5, that the indicator around breastfeeding is the same indicator being collected by those working in the Ministry of Health and also the one being tracked by those working in a different department in planning? I know that you may have had this, those of you working in nutrition, you've probably come across this. One person is looking at exclusive breastfeeding from birth. Another one is looking at breastfeeding from birth, and those numbers are different. So are we on the same page? Where is the money coming from? Are we coordinating on human capital and a lot of these things? So coordination, for me, and the kind of work we're doing has become one of those areas that we feel requires some considerable attention. In some countries, when we have federal systems and distribution of functions, some of the work that we're doing that is related to SDG 2 is being collected by semi-autonomous and sometimes autonomous units at the sub-national level. And that, in some of those countries, this problem of coordination is even more aggravated. So African countries, in their struggle to try and make progress on this, eventually came to a moment. So this image is from 2014, and despite what some people might believe, the tall gentleman there is not related to me. He is the president of Rwanda. But the thing about this image that stayed with me from the first time I saw it was the political will that was in this room. There was a significant number of high-level heads of state and members of government, including heads of state and government. And the Malabo Declaration came out of this meeting, which in a way was an attempt to try and improve the pace at which we were moving. So just to give you an example, at this point, in 2011, 2013, you are looking at about 25% of most of Africa experiencing hunger and malnutrition. This was maybe an 8% increase on the numbers from 1990. So in 20 years, only 8% increase improvement had happened. And this was not a pace that was going to be sustainable. So within the context of the CADEP results framework and working towards 2025, we needed to accelerate this. What happens with the Malabo Declaration is that it looks at agriculture, food security, not just from a very thematic window, but looks at it from a multi-sectoral window, which is what my colleague, Mr. Caron, talked about, that intersectionality of the SDGs. So you have your financing, you have health, you have trade, you have resilience, all of them built into these 7 commitments. And out of this, of course, we ended up with the declaration. 7 themes, 43 performance indicators. In any one country, you're looking at more than 20 ministries, departments, and agencies in government that are collecting and providing data for reporting on this. But in addition, many countries, there's a general understanding that data doesn't just come from government, but also comes from non-government sources. So there's an effort within this framework to include the data from non-state sources. So local international development partners have also, at the national level, been tapped to provide the data on this. 40-something countries, I'm forgetting my number, I think 47 countries reported. 47? Yeah. 30 countries did a very good job in terms of making data available on all those issues. You're looking at 100, remember, more than 150 pieces of data that were needed to compute these indicators. Kenya, which I'm going to focus on a little bit because it's home to me, had 88% of the data available. And Kenya was among the top 5, top 6 countries when you're looking at the amount of data that was reported. So Kenya did really well. But like in many countries, there were indicators we couldn't report on. 9 indicators in our case. A couple of those nobody reported on anyway. So maybe 7 are the ones that we would really judge ourselves for not having been able to report. We asked ourselves, so countries were able to report. They went through a tedious exercise. I think if you talk to a lot of the countries that were involved in the people who were involved in the collection of this data will tell you that it was not an easy process. The data collection has started now. I believe there's going to be a validation exercise before a final report later this year, which is then submitted to the African Union, and then tabled at the African Union Summit at the beginning of next year, because that's when the next effort is happening. So we asked, if we are to access this data, where can you find it? And we're using this a bit as a proxy for the effort that goes into sharing that data so that it can be used for decision-making even within government. And what we found was, just looking at a country like Kenya that did extremely well, you have 152 data sets. I need to correct, that's actually 152 of those data sets in this list include for a couple of indicators that are still a bit tier 3 in a way. And of course, you're looking at 37 performance indicators in total that we're looking at. I just want to point out that after looking at 4 countries, we found that the amount of data that was available in the open was not as much as you would have expected, considering that 88% of the data, for instance, for Kenya was found. So we know it exists. And the number of indicators that would have been covered if we were doing that exercise purely based on data that's available in the public domain would only have served for 13 indicators. So it means in 2021, when the data collection on late 2020 going into 2021, when countries are going to start preparing for the 2022 biennial review, they're going to go through another painful, long exercise of finding the data to report on this. And this is affecting political will in countries. It's affecting the morale of the civil service, because this is seen as an exercise to report. And I think this is the same thing we're going to find with HLPF. We see this as a collection exercise to report on indicators that are more or less agreed at an international level. So there's a need to bring this down to the national level. And I just want to close with these 3 things. One, we need to think about a framework for coordination more deliberately. If we don't, this affects our mutual accountability effort, and of course affects our ability to deliver on zero hunger. And I'm saying this mostly because of the Malabo Declaration, which has a significant number of ministries, departments, and agencies involved. If we don't invest in institutional strengthening as part of our means of implementation, deliberate institutional strengthening will be at risk. The number of means of implementation commitments and targets that relate to the extent to which an institution in the public service is able to access and use data for decision making, I think is an area that will require continuous effort. And of course, we need to prioritize the delivery of data and evidence for decision making, probably more than for reporting. If this data and evidence is useful at the level where people are trying to get their jobs done, I think we have better chances of having this data available on an ongoing basis and reducing the burden on reporting that already exists because of the focus on reporting more than the focus on decision making. So let's strengthen our institutions as a priority. Let's figure out how to coordinate on data on a deliberate whole of government approach, and let's mandate openness so that when that data is used for reporting, it's also available for everybody else to see how that computation was done for that indicator, and allow other stakeholders to come to the same conclusion. So that will be my last 3 things. I'm looking forward to sharing with you our report that you saw in one of the slides that was supposed to have been published yesterday with a technical problem. So that will be due. It will be disseminated today online, and essentially a 4-country study of the openness of the data that is behind some of the indicators for SDG 2, but essentially for the entire Malabo framework. That's our website. You can keep a lookout on that. My email address is mushiri@thatdomain, developlocal.org. I look forward to engaging further on this. Thank you.